My name is Loris Kokomchin. I'll be doing a short presentation on the life and work of the American philosopher John Dewey. John Dewey has been regarded as the father of the progressive educational movement in the United States of America. The structure of this presentation would start with a short video on the life and work of John Dewey, the philosopher. Then I will be doing an analysis of the life and work of John Dewey, and the presentation would conclude with a summary of the life and work of John Dewey. I hope the presentation would be informative, so at the end, the takeaway would be you understand who John Dewey the philosopher is, who John Dewey the educator is, who John Dewey the reformer is, who John Dewey the psychologist is, and more importantly, who John Dewey is as a person. Thank you.
What is pragmatism? John Dewey lived between 1859 and 1952, and he was from Burlington, Vermont. He taught at the University of Michigan, the University of Chicago, and Columbia University. He was a philosophical pragmatist and was fundamentally committed to democracy. He focused on schools and civil society to promote the achievement of democracy. Pragmatism is an American school of philosophy. It holds that if something is true, it is true because it works. How do we know that science is true? Well, look at all of the stuff that we can build using science. Dewey's specific form of pragmatism is called instrumentalism. That is, when theories are the instruments or tools by which we know reality. Dewey had a connection to Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau gave us progressivist education. We are progressively to learn from our experiences. Otherwise, we'll be indoctrinated into vanity. Dewey gives us a pragmatist, or what's known as a democratic progressivist education. We are to progressively learn by doing. Democracies best enable the sort of learning needed for this learning in educational classrooms. So what are the implications of pragmatism? Well, since the truth is known by how it works, then education needs to focus on having students progressively acquire skills, and that is learning by doing. Since how something works is always related to the way other things work, then education needs to be interdisciplinary so that students can learn the interconnection among skills. An implication of his instrumentalism is one of his unique approaches to teaching. This approach is that we learn best by doing, and it is called experiential learning. The idea is that you only learn to be a scientist, for example, by working in a lab. Proper education and skills should come from what pupils already find interesting. Students can be given a problem, and then they can learn to work together to solve the problem by drawing on the knowledge of a variety of disciplines. Dewey held that democracies need both to educate its citizens in the liberal arts and that they could do it better than other societies. Democracies need to educate their citizens. Unlike monarchies or aristocracies, everyone in a democracy makes political decisions. So democracy needs to educate all its citizens in those matters that are pertinent to political decisions. Dewey argues that democracies are better at educating, and since a good education comes through progressive experience and the skills of experimentation, and since democracies afford everyone an equal opportunity to experiment, then everyone will have a better educational experience than societies that choose specific subclasses of people who one might call the knowers.
John Dewey. As we learned from the presentation, John Dewey's life spanned approximately 93 years. He was a great American educational philosopher, a philosophical pragmatist, committed to democracy, and also a pioneer in functional psychology. He has been regarded as a leader of the progressive educational movement in America. Education according to John Dewey. He described education as a process of living and not a preparation for future living. He said, give the pupils something to do, not something to learn, and the doing is of such a nature as to demand thinking. Learning naturally exists. Basically, learning by doing through working together, discussion of ideas, and project based learning. Learning naturally takes place. In earlier slides, John Dewey is regarded as the father of the progressive education movement in America. What this means is that everything you know about traditional learning and education, such as classroom learning, teacher centered learning, he advocates basically the opposite. That is, student centered learning. And learning should not be about the what, but more about the how. Instead of subject matter, he advocates for methods. What is the method of doing something? Instead of the center of learning should be on how, not a perfect or a good curriculum. He championed that the child should be at the center of learning. That is what progressive education meant to John Dewey. Now, what education did John Dewey give us? He gives us a pragmatist or a democratic progressive version of education. As he puts it, education is not preparation for life. Education is life itself. And as mentioned earlier slides, John Dewey described education as give the pupil something to do, not something to learn, and the doing is of such a nature as to demand thinking. Learning naturally exists. John Dewey advocates and proposes that in order for learning to be effective, it should be centered on doing. You will see this theme repeating and recurring throughout John Dewey's writing, teaching, philosophy, and in this presentation. In the previous slide, what education did John Dewey gives us? He gives us a pragmatist or a progressive education. American pragmatism, according to John Dewey, basically means truth equal what works. And he further stated, it holds that something is true. It is true because it works. He further went on to say that if we teach today's students as we taught yesterday's, we rob them of tomorrow. John Dewey advocates in the pragmatist theory inquiry. Be of an inquiring mind, cultivate critically reflective thought, and be socially and actively engaged with established knowledge, and not to be passive. As we have learned in the video presentation, the example in the biology class, student learning how to grow flowers, for example. Student plant flowers from a seed and a stem and watch it grow and develop and ready to harvest. By the mere fact students are involved in the how to grow flowers, they learn the method instead of a textbook or a teacher lecturing the process of how to grow flowers. This is the educational philosophy that John Dewey taught us. We learned from the previous slide John Dewey theory of pragmatism. Now, what form of pragmatism did John Dewey advocate? First, it is important to note that pragmatism comes from the Greek word to do or to make. John Dewey's form of pragmatism is that knowledge and thinking are closely associated with action and doing. Hence, he called this form of pragmatism instrumentalism. He sees knowledge, theory, and thinking as instruments or tools by which we know reality. John Dewey further stated, the self is not something ready-made, but something in continuous formation through choice of action. The implication of pragmatism. The essence of the pragmatist theory is learning by doing. Since we learn how things work and other things work, education needs to be interdisciplinary so students can learn the interconnections among skills. According to John Dewey, American pragmatism is the center of sciences and the humanities. Pragmatism stands between idealism and materialism. The implication he emphasized is the practical life of the child. It prepares the child for future life in every effective manner. It develops the child's love for democratic values and social efficiency, and bring harmonious adjustment and development of personality of the child, according to John Dewey. He further went on to state that the implication is that education is life. We must see education as growth, education as a social process, education as a continuous restructuring of experience, and as education as the responsibility of the state. Those are the implications of pragmatism. You extract any one of those and take it out from the pragmatism theory, according to John Dewey, learning by doing diminishes. Throughout this presentation thus far, that John Dewey is regarded as the father of the progressive educational movement in America. Then it asks the obvious question, what is John Dewey's approach to teaching? John Dewey said, we learn best by doing, by drawing on the knowledge on a variety of disciplines. He described this type of learning as experiential learning. He emphasized a more student-centered learning. Learning should be all about the student. Hence, the curriculum should be designed, developed, and customized to fit the particular need of the student. Also, as discussed throughout this presentation, John Dewey's approach to teaching is more practical and emphasized the art of doing, making things. Hence, learning could be more effective. He encouraged project-based learning, discussion, and group learning to find solutions to more complex problems. From the opening slide, John Dewey is committed to democracy, and he describes democracy comes from good education and by educating its citizens. According to John Dewey, democracy has to be born anew every generation, and education is the midwife. Also, John Dewey's philosophy on education and democracy is also in line with other renowned world figures in the fight for democracy. According to Mahatma Gandhi, the great civil rights leader and the father of the nation of India, what is really needed to make democracy function is not knowledge of facts, but right education. In summarizing the life and work of John Dewey, the presenter is of the view that four basic questions encapsulate the life and work of John Dewey. First, who is John Dewey? An American progressive educational philosopher, a psychologist, and an educational reformer. Second, what is John Dewey philosophy? His philosophy is that curriculum should be relevant to students' lives. Third, what school of thought John Dewey is a proponent of? Pragmatism. And finally, what is John Dewey's approach to learning and teaching? Learning by doing, student centered approach. Thank you.